ticked off with what we're doing with the world.
Yeah, she doesn't look happy about it.
I wouldn't be either. Now, back about, and nobody knows exactly how far, but something like 160,000 years ago, the number of humans on Earth was very small.
Yeah.
They literally have been one tribe, and very few of their kids survived. Now, they can track through the female line who your parentage is.
Right.
Because in each cell, there's a little thing that's like the power plant. And it appears to have come from before there were even animals. It's been around forever. It probably was around
RNA.
some. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, I just painted her. We don't know what she looked like, other than the fact that she was black. And she is the mother of at least all women on Earth, and probably the mother of everybody on Earth. Not that there weren't other people in the tribe, but if their line went to men or died out somewhere along the line, they didn't continue to go into it. The main thing about it is it tells us at one point it was very close. And it may be the time when all the other critters, Australopithecines, Homo erectus, we don't see signs of them anymore. So apparently there was a really bad time, ice age, heat waves, plagues, whatever it was, just about wiped out everybody. And she's a survivor. Now, this one, I'm speculating. There was a goddess a long time ago, we can't be sure, 11,000, 12,000 years ago, Hecate, who continued on into Greek and Roman mythology, but appears to be associated with even before agriculture. So this is a tribal group of hunters. What's interesting is those same people, about 11,000 BC, erected a fabulous temple, put Stonehenge to shame, absolutely. You can look it up on the internet, they're excavating it, it's huge and it's wonderful, smooth stones, beautiful carvings, and done by a bunch of people who hunted for a living. They did apparently make booze, because they have found some cavities in stone where they were doing something. It only makes sense if it was
Some kind of fermentation.
Yeah. Probably wild berries. Anyway, I did her up as a albino because albinos would have been thought as particularly spiritual. But if there was not a individual Hecate, she's representative of the various priestesses and shamans and wise women that kept people like that going, knew where to find things, knew how to heal things. So she's a general representative. Circe is from the Odyssey, but I have her in because about that time, about the time of Troy, there were an awful lot of stories about women sorceresses.
Yeah.
Whatever they were doing, and it probably wasn't hocus pocus, it probably was healing. But anyway, there are a ton of them, and you don't hear much of them after. You get into later on classical Greek times, not so much.
Yeah, it switches over to men, Aristotle, Plato, Socrates.
So she herself may or may not have actually existed, but once again, she's a representative of something that was going on. Helen of Troy, now, she in herself, well, it's a big deal that her story survived and all that. I put her in partly because it's kind of fun. At that time, the Greeks and well into the classical period did not know how to make siege engines. So when they came up against walls, the best they could do was ladders, which is dicey if the people on top know what they're doing. However, some of the guys that came over with Agamemnon and Achilles may have been in the Assyrian army, and the Assyrians did know how to make siege engines. So they're building a siege tower, rolls along on wheels, has the tall thing with the ramp, and they covered them, the Assyrians anyway, covered them in hides, green hides, right off the animal, because then if you fired an arrow at it, it wouldn't burn. And the Trojans were well known for raising horses, so I'm guessing they covered the thing in horsehide when they finally got it going. So it rolled up to the wall, the Greeks got over, and that's the Trojan horse, which the later guys wouldn't have known. She is an Amazon, and we always thought the Amazons were just a story. And around about 1972, a Russian archaeologist dug up a mound called the Kurgan, and in it, in a proper grave, was a horse with all the trimmings, and bows and arrows, and a sword, and a woman. And she was like 6 feet tall and probably pretty muscular, which to a bunch of people in sort of the Middle East or even in Greece at that time would have been a big deal.
Yes.
Anyway, they have done DNA testing, and there's a little bit of their lineage left in Mongolia. There are some red-haired tall girls show up every now and again. So that's the last of them that we know. But they were a bunch of redheads, and they were big, and they herded, that's a very early cow, Jacob sheep. It's not a goat. They herded sheep in the plains, and the women and the men were both excellent riders, and since they used a bow, were deadly up against most groups. But they did have the sword, because if there's some guy down there trying to cut your horse's legs, it's nice to be able to reach down. So, but they're the source of the Amazons. So when Herodotus was talking about the Amazons, it wasn't kidding. They really existed. They eventually got killed off, probably by people who became the Mongols, because they were competing for the same territory. But anyway, I think it's kind of neat that they actually, and they found more of the graves since. There's a number of, there are men buried too with all the gear. And there are a few priestesses, they assume, because they're just buried with like a dagger and more jewelry. But some of them were obviously warriors. I put Mary Magdalene in simply because she's the only one of the disciples that actually had the nerve to go to the crucifixion. Jesus' mother and aunt, perhaps, we don't know the relationship, went. And I'm assuming that's Joseph of Arimathea, who was the one that gave him the grave. But all the rest of them hid. And of course, the Romans would never have bothered a girl. Ever, ever. So she was perfectly safe. And then she's the one that goes to the grave. So I think she deserves better press than she gets.
And so you gave her some there.
I gave her some. Caesar and Cleopatra are both perfectly well known. What's kind of neat is these are two of the smartest people that ever lived. And they had one kid, and Octavian, who was going to become Augustus Caesar, had his throat cut because the kid might have been really something. But they're an interesting pairing. It's easy to misinterpret her. She didn't actually seduce a whole bunch of people that we know of. She seduced a couple of high-profile Romans, which makes good political sense. Never mind the rest of it. But Caesar, who could have almost anything he wanted, she was living in Rome, so that they could still be doing things together. Says something about her. Now this one, back about the same time that King Arthur was beating heads in with a broadsword, Japan was only half conquered by the Oriental people that came across from Korea. And the Ainu still ran the rest of it. And at that point, there were like 27 kingdoms, all cutting each other's throats, burning each other's villages. And this teenage girl, Himiko, walked out and stopped them dead. The funny thing is, the Japanese did not like the story. They wrote her out of their history.
Yes.
Peace? Who wants peace? But anyway, luckily, the Chinese emperor was intrigued. So he sent somebody over, and that guy's report still exists. So we know when she did it, we know some of the numbers. We don't know how she did it. She couldn't have blackmailed all 27 kingdoms. She didn't fight any wars. Chances are she used magic, or at least presumed magic. And since this became known later on, modern times, they have picked a village out that they say was her village. Nobody knows, but it's a place tourists could go to. And they have no idea where she's buried. It's in a mound someplace, but which mound, where? Good luck. But she's just fascinating because how did she pull it off? And yet we can prove she did. This is Zenobia. She married the king of Palmyra in northern Syria. And ISIS went in there later and blew half the town up, which is a pity. Beautiful place. But anyway, her husband married her because she was beautiful and interesting. When he died, a little young, she just took over as queen. Technically, her son was the king, but he was an infant and she really didn't play by the rules. Anyway, she was apparently not only very beautiful, but politically adept and something of a military genius. She put together an army that swept out of Palmyra and conquered most of what we call the Middle East, about half of what had been the Persian Empire, and then made a terrible mistake. She conquered Egypt, and Egypt was a source of grain for the Romans. That would be like somebody from Russia taking over Saudi Arabia. The Americans would go to war.
Yeah.
Well, the Romans fired the guy who was emperor at the time, who had been ineffective, and they brought in a guy who was quite a famous general from one time in Europe. And he came and he beat her by the simple thing of building one fort after another across the desert. So her cavalry couldn't cut the supply lines or catch people in the open. And the last battle in front of Palmyra, if they're right, and according to Roman sources, she might have won, except her cavalry got super excited after routing the Roman cavalry and ran off after the Romans instead of coming around in behind. And so she was defeated. She was taken to Rome in chains to be exhibited and then to be strangled, because that's what they did when they took. Yeah. Well, somehow or other, she not only did not get strangled, she married a Roman senator. And then the part I would love to know, but we never will at all, is the emperor that defeated her was assassinated. Couldn't have anything to do with her. And of course, no one will ever know, because if anybody had known, she'd have died right there.
Yeah.
But her descendants are in Italy. Anyway, quite a character. And she did ride with her troops, and I don't know that she actually used the bow and arrow on the front line. She was probably too smart for that. But she drank with them and traveled with them and fought with them in a sense, so not bad. Now, I paint tolerably well. That lady over there actually paints better than I do, but we won't go into that. That's a polymer clay statue of a woman on Crete when Thera, Santorini, blew up, and a wave came at them about the speed of a 747 and Lord knows how high.
Pyroclastic flow.
It hit them hard. And it did in the Minoan civilization, which my guess, and it's just my guess, there's nothing to support it, the Minoans, I think, had invented the keel for their boats, so they could outsail everybody else who were around bottom ones. But whatever it was, they were artistic, they were peaceful, they traded, there are no pictures of warriors anywhere in their art, and they ruled the Eastern Mediterranean for a long, long time. And when Thera blew up, that was it for them. The waves smashed the coastline and all their ships and warehouses and half the cities. The Mycenaeans came in, took over, a bunch of local pirates. But anyway, it may be that she was Atlantis. Now, this isn't quite in the time frame, but that's Rebecca Boone, Daniel Boone's wife.
Okay.
Daniel would go out and hunt, half the winter to get hides to sell, which is what they use to pay their taxes, buy axes, whatever. She got to keep track of the farm, getting the firewood, maybe putting up new buildings, tilling the fields, and hunting for food as well, because he was off somewhere else. And every now and again something happened, like he got captured by the natives for a while, happened a couple of times, and she was it. And as far as we can tell, she was probably as good a hunter as Daniel, although maybe not as good a shot, because he was supposed to be really fabulous. But she was a pretty tough cookie. And you don't hear anything much about her, because of course it's all Daniel.
Yes.
We know when she was born and where, and we think we know where she died, and she comes up every now and again in the writings about Boonesboro in Kentucky. And of course they got hornswoggled out of their farm in Kentucky and had to move to the Mississippi Valley, and they went no further. She died there. Their grandkids end up going out of the prairies. But now, this one is kind of fun and very, very hard to research. That's Guinevere, who was not a princess, as far as we can tell. She was almost certainly a Pict. And we don't know, where did the Picts go question? Well, it seems like they simply intermarried with the people who came over from Ireland, the Scotti.
Yep.
They're still there. But at the time, the Romans were holding Hadrian's Wall, and it took several Roman legions as well as some local militia to hold it. And they had Picts who acted like scouts and auxiliary troops north of the wall. Well, when the Romans went into one of their last civil wars, they pulled the legions completely out of England. So you got a few militia guys, they can't hold the wall anymore. And the Picts who were north of the wall, well, they had to get out of Dodge, because it was not going to be pretty. Anyway, as far as I can tell, and there's good reason to believe that Arthur's real name was Owain, and he and his dad went south to the Welsh border. And Guinevere went along with him, because he didn't have much choice. Now, what's her real name? Hard to say. Some people think that this is a really corrupted French version of a Pictish word that means chieftainess. Other people say it translates as white lily. Nobody speaks Pictish, nobody reads Pictish, take your pick. But if she went south, she was probably relatively young, because I don't think the older folks would have gambled going in that territory. Theodora was very low class. She was the daughter of a guy that trained bears for the circus in Byzantium. And we're talking around 500 AD. So Byzantium was big deal. She was not. But she was smart, she was pretty, and she caught the eye of Justinian, who was the emperor. And he's a big deal. He wrote the Roman code of laws that's still in use in the world. And his guy managed to conquer a great deal of northern Europe and got halfway into Italy before bubonic plague or malaria or something stopped them. We just know they got sick. Anyway, she was co-ruler with Justinian as far as he was concerned.
Okay.
He elevated her so he could marry her, because otherwise he couldn't have married her. She was too low class. And partway through their reign, they had a Democrat and Republican thing going on, blues and greens from horse racing in the Coliseum there. But they were spread out much further. Their political parties, they got enough power together that they got together in the Hippodrome to hold a meeting to decide if they could get together and overthrow Justinian. And Justinian was no coward and very capable. And his top general, the guy that conquered all this stuff, Belisarius, was with him. The two of them were outfitting a boat to make a run for it. And she said, "You can run, I'll stay. Purple makes the best shroud. they actually recorded, she said winding sheet, but anyway, they actually recorded it, and she shamed them, and they stuck around, and they sent their Hun bodyguard there, locked the gate of the hippodrome. The Huns went up on the edge with bow and arrow and just started killing people until they gave up. So she kept the Byzantine Empire going. She's just fun. Eleanor of Aquitaine slept with half of the crowned heads in Western Europe. She was queen to Louis, but the picture is from Louis, who was, they called him Louis the Pious. I think he should have been called Louis the Simple. Anyway, he took her along. She probably didn't give him any choice. And she dressed as an Amazon and rode with the knights. And everybody was horrified. But anyway, when they finally got home after an unsuccessful crusade, she was kind of tired of Louis, and she ran into this guy that ran England at the time, Henry II. And the story is she said to people, she looked at Henry and committed adultery on the spot. Anyway, she switched over. Well, she was no bed of roses for Henry. She led at least 3 revolts against him, trying to put Richard on the throne. Hey, what can you say? She was that kind of gal. Tomo-Guizan, Japanese know her. Nobody in the West would particularly. As the Orientals moved north, they interbred with the Ainu, who were big guys. Sumo wrestlers come with that blood. Every now and again, apparently, one of the women would have all the size and strength of an Ainu person, as well as the skill set and athleticism of her own group. Well, she became a sumo warrior and married a guy who tried his luck at a civil war to unseat the shogun and emperor. They lost. They got pushed all the way back onto a peninsula, and there were probably only a few dozen left, maybe a couple score of the revolt people. She's with them, and she tells her husband, "I'll die with you." You know, he says, "Don't be silly." Okay, so she picks out the biggest, toughest samurai on the other side, rides straight at him, cuts him out of the saddle, and then cuts her way out through this army. Nobody wanted to face her. And she went to a temple and became a temple guardian. And apparently nobody bothered her because she was just the best samurai that ever lived. And if you went into the hallway of the temple, you were coming out. Joan of Arc, certainly well known. What's interesting for me is in some ways she's the first modern general. After Orleans fell, she fought about 4 little battles until she cornered the English army at Patay and then nearly destroyed it. The difference was the guys that she was around were used to, we fight one big battle and then we all drink and go home. She didn't. They're still out there. We're still going. And they went along with it. Now, ultimately, she was done in by the fact that the king did not want to spend any money on it. You know, God's with you, let him pay. But it's just interesting. She's interesting in her own right. This little lady, everybody knows the Three Musketeers story.
Yep.
She's a little after them, but she fought at least 10 duels and killed 3 of them, never lost, probably fought a bunch more because when she was young, she and another guy went around taverns. And it was the, I've got 5 francs as I can beat any man in the house. And they'd go out and she was trained very young. Apparently at the age of 12, she could beat all the men in the fencing she was in. Who knows? But anyway, of all things, she becomes an opera singer. And she sings soprano in the Paris Opera. And then she thinks she likes Italian opera. So she learns how to sing alto in the Paris Opera, not on a street corner. And so she's an opera singer for a while. In the meantime, she's up to all kinds of shenanigans, including the fact that she actually mostly dressed as a man and mostly pursued the ladies, which got her into trouble one time in court when 3 of the ladies she was dancing with and romancing had partners, and they called her out. So she beat all 3 of them. Anyway, Emily de Châtelet was a good friend of Voltaire's.
Okay.
And this is just before the French Revolution.
Yep.
Anyway, Isaac Newton had done all of his work. And somebody came to Emily who could read several languages, was a mathematician, was a scientist, said, "Do you mind translating it?" She said, "Sure." So she translates Isaac Newton's work. Then she says to the guy, "I think there's a couple of mistakes in there. Do you mind if I fix them?" And son of a gun, she did. But she tested it. She put a big thing of clay and went up step ladders and dropped weights and determined the energy by how far they went into the clay. Newton had done a reasonable thing. He said energy equals mass times velocity. And when she read that, she thought, doesn't quite make sense. It doesn't. It is actually energy equals mass times velocity squared. We're used to E equal mc squared. That's just one variation. But she's the one that discovered the original. And she may be the only person ever capable of correcting Isaac Newton, which is kind of neat. And Voltaire was no slouch, but he always played
I've
second.
read a dozen of his books. Yeah.
Well, he always played second fiddle to her. Figured she was smarter. Ada Lovelace was Lord Byron's daughter. And her mother hated Byron up one side and down the other because he ran around all over the place. Anyway, she would not let Ada do any writing, plays, poetry, made her do math and science. Well, it turns out she was quite good at them. And she's the one somebody asked her to do translations. Charles Babbage made what's called the first computer. It was actually like a big adding machine. You cranked it and there were gears. It was close. Anyway,
He tried to build a second one, but he didn't get funding for it.
and probably they couldn't do the gears well enough.
Yeah.
Too many.
Yeah.
But anyway, Babbage had somebody in Italy write a book about his work. We didn't read Italian. She did. So we went to her and said, "Can you translate it?" Kind of like back here. Sure. So she translated it. And then she said to Babbage, "Do you mind?" And she wrote something that's apparently like about 4 times as big. And she invented modern computing. She figured out punch cards because they were using in the looms. She figured out the use of algorithms. A whole bunch of stuff never occurred. Well, lovely. It's just they figured out later on that it would have taken 12 complete railway trains and Babbage machines to do what she was thinking. It needed electronics. Anyway, it went away. Nobody knew about all this work because it made no sense to anybody. It was like talking about magic potions. Until World War II. And the guy that made the bomb and translated the British stuff came across her work and said, "Oh my God," although he was thinking some of the same stuff. The one terrible thing is, when she married, her husband didn't want to give her any money to speak of, household money. But, bring me the bills and all that. So she decided to do horse racing forms. So she worked out all the math and got some friends together and they put money in. They lost their shirts because horse racing is fixed. What are you going to do? Anyway, she was somewhat discredited because of that. These two, at one point, not them originally, somebody discovered that vats of yogurt sometimes had no bacteria and sometimes were pretty messy. And they discovered this little critter in there that's, you could think of it as being like a separate bacteria. It was actually a little different. But it was eating some of the bad bacteria. That was about 1987, but they didn't know what to do with it. So it's just, yes, I've seen it. They got together in Germany at a conference. Charpentier ran a lab in Germany, and Doudna was from, I believe, Berkeley. I'll probably put it down there. Anyway, they said, we can do something with this. So in effect, they learned how to train these things. So they would go to a strand of DNA and bite out just one section. And then you dump a vial of what you want to replace it in, and your body naturally puts it into the DNA. Genetic engineering, and very precise. As phenomenal a thing as could be thought of with any of these different people. The leap to, I can train a bacterium to do work for me on DNA. They did get the Nobel Prize. It's not they're unknown, but interestingly enough, some of the men back from 1987 said, oh, we should have got the Nobel Prize, we found it. Which is kind of like, I found a rock, you made a sculpture. Oh yeah, but it's mine. My rock. Yeah. Anyway, these ones, about 1500 BC.
My blueberries?
No.
I found them.
Yeah, I know.
About 1500 BC, Egypt was just starting up the Golden Age. And the guy who was pharaoh was married to a sister, Hatshepsut. He died. She didn't kill him off as far as anybody knows. But instead of just being regent for her stepson, because she only had daughters, she took over as pharaoh. And she was full tilt pharaoh. She actually used to go out with a fake beard for ceremonial occasions, which is probably gilding the lily. But anyway, she was 5 foot tall and fairly cute, because interestingly enough, they have found.
I love short women.
Yeah.
Sorry.
You'll get ganged up on. Anyway, they have found her mummy. They thought it was the mummy of a serving lady, but Hatshepsut had given one of her teeth that was extracted with gold on it and everything in a little box to one of the servants. And they checked the DNA in the tooth to the mummy, and it's Hatshepsut's mummy. Anyway, she fought one war in the beginning with the very south of Egypt, up in the highlands. They thought they'd revolt, and she didn't think they should. And after that, she was all trade, agriculture, architecture. Her pyramid isn't a pyramid at all. It is a wonderful thing. Looks like it would be okay in Athens. Lots of pillars, different rooms for different religions. This is the outside of it with her statues. And that ramp, and then there's gardens, and then there's another ramp down to the river. Anyway, the guy that she kept from the throne, because she died in her 50s, was Thutmose. And he's a big deal. He's their Napoleon. And apparently the two of them got along fine, and he was perfectly happy to have her running the place, which is kind of neat, actually. But it was a big, big deal for Egypt. And everybody does know in Egyptian history about her, but there's a lot of people that thought she was the evil queen. No indication that she was. Now, last but not least, one of my favorites, Camille Claudel joined Auguste Rodin's studio. She was about 18 and already recognized as a gifted sculptor. She did various things to his specifications, but before she parted ways with him and she became his mistress, they got his studio got a commission to do a fancy set of doors for what would be a new art library. And the normal pattern and the way he set up his original ones was like panels, and each panel would have a scene. That's the way everybody did doors. That's the way he set it out originally. Somewhere along in there, the idea came to do Dante's Inferno on the doors. And he never gave it to the people that ordered it. He covered it with a tarp. It was not released until after his death. And from it, he took the thinker the Three Graces, a number of other minor pieces. He mined it for art the rest of his life. She left him, could not get much work, and when she finally got a big commission from, I think, the main museum in Paris for a large sculpture, he got them to pull the plug on it. And she got put into an insane asylum, which in 1909, the head of the asylum, and I think it was a new one coming in, said, "Why is she here? She's perfectly sane." Well, I think you can kind of guess. And the thing about it is that most of this stuff is what I would consider Gothic. Gothic sculpture is like the Minoan girl. She's looking at something you can't see, rather than she's all, like the Thinker, the Kiss, the pieces we know Rodin did are very Romanesque, very closed in. You're not looking at the rest of the world. What she did was very Gothic, and her later pieces were very Gothic. I think that's her work. And I think that's why she ended up in an asylum, and I think that's why he kept it covered. Anyway, she died in 1942, still in an asylum.
Yes, thank you.
That was an awesome presentation.
Yes.
Well done.
Yeah, it was
We get these lessons while